The 6-year-old boy doesn't flinch as his father's axe splits the thief's skull. He's seen it before. Last week when they hanged the miller for short weighing grain. Yesterday when the village boys stoned a cat to death for sport. By age 10, this child will have witnessed more violent deaths than most modern soldiers see in combat. By 15, he'll have killed someone himself, maybe in a tavern brawl, maybe in his lord's wars, maybe just because someone looked at his sister wrong. And here's the truly terrifying part. He won't have PTSD. He won't need therapy. He'll sleep just fine. Because medieval people weren't born more violent than us. They were manufactured into killing machines by a world that made brutality as essential as breathing. Imagine growing up where your drinking water is contaminated with lead that literally eats your impulse control, where parasites in your gut pump aggression hormones into your bloodstream, where watching public torture is Tuesday's entertainment, and participating in it is how you prove you're a man, where every single adult you know has killed someone and thinks you're weird if you haven't. This isn't about barbarism or lack of civilization. It's about how environment can transform ordinary humans into casual killers who gut their neighbours over stolen chickens and sleep like babies afterward. Modern neuroscience just figured out why medieval people were so comfortable with extreme violence, and the answer will make you question everything you think you know about human nature. Because it turns out we're all just 3 environmental factors away from becoming medieval-level violent. The only difference between us and them, we removed those factors. They didn't have that choice. Let's start with what was literally poisoning medieval minds. Lead. Every cup they drank from, every plate they ate off, every pot they cooked in, glazed with lead compounds that gave that attractive shine. The wealthy had it worse, drinking wine from lead-lined vessels, sweetening their food with lead acetate they called sugar of lead. Modern analysis of medieval skeletons shows lead levels that would cause immediate medical intervention today, concentrations that destroy prefrontal cortex function, annihilate impulse control, and create what we now recognise as intermittent explosive disorder. A baron flying into murderous rage over spilled wine wasn't displaying noble temperament. He was lead poisoned to the point of brain damage. Multiply this by entire populations consuming lead daily from birth, and you get a society where violent overreaction isn't a personality flaw, but a widespread neurological condition. But lead was just the beginning of the biological assault on medieval brains. Toxoplasma gondii, a parasite from cat feces, infected up to 80% of medieval populations due to poor sanitation and close living with animals. Modern studies show this parasite literally rewires the brain to increase risk-taking and aggression. It makes mice lose their fear of cats. Imagine what it does to human fear responses. Then add chronic traumatic encephalopathy from constant head injuries. Every medieval child played games involving head blows. Every adult had been knocked unconscious multiple times in fights, falls, or work accidents. No helmets for common soldiers, no safety equipment for workers, no understanding that concussions cause permanent personality changes. The average medieval brain was a cocktail of heavy metal poisoning, parasitic infection, and repeated trauma. A neurological perfect storm for violence. The very food they ate programmed them for aggression. Medieval diets heavy in meat and alcohol, low in tryptophan-rich foods, created chronic serotonin deficiencies. Without this crucial neurotransmitter for mood regulation, they lived in a constant state of irritability and hair-trigger rage. Feast or famine cycles meant their bodies operated in survival mode, flooding them with stress hormones that made violence seem like a reasonable solution to any problem. Archaeological evidence shows testosterone levels in medieval men were significantly higher than modern males, partly from diet, partly from constant physical labour, partly from social structures that rewarded hypermasculinity. When everyone you meet is neurologically primed for violence, biochemically programmed for aggression, and hormonally optimised for combat, peaceful conflict resolution becomes nearly impossible. Now layer onto this biological powder keg the psychological reality of medieval childhood. By age 5, you'd likely watched siblings die. Infant mortality meant most families lost multiple children. Death wasn't abstract. It was the baby who stopped moving in the cradle next to you. You'd see animals slaughtered daily, their death throes as normal as sunrise. Public executions weren't hidden from children. They were lifted onto shoulders for better views. A typical medieval child witnessed dozens of people die violently before puberty. Criminals hanged, heretics burned, thieves mutilated, enemies dismembered. But watching wasn't enough. Children were expected to participate, throwing stones at pillory victims, gathering wood for execution fires, cheering as bodies twitched. This wasn't cruelty but education, teaching them that violence was how society functioned. The games children played prepared them for this violent life. Hot cockles involved being blindfolded and beaten while guessing who hit you. Hammer and block had kids taking turns hitting each other with sticks. These weren't aberrations, but mainstream entertainment that taught pain tolerance and normalised inflicting suffering. By adolescence, boys graduated to more serious violence. Apprentices formed gangs that fought rival trades with clubs and knives. Village youth had ritualised battles on feast days that regularly ended in deaths. The authorities didn't stop this. They encouraged it as training for war. A boy who couldn't take a beating or give one was considered unfit for adult life. Girls weren't exempt. They learned to use household implements as weapons, understanding that defending home and honour might require splitting skulls with cooking pots. Medieval society didn't just tolerate this violence. It required it. Without police forces, everyone was responsible for their own protection. Refusing to use violence when insulted or threatened marked you as weak, inviting more predation. The concept of honour meant you had to respond violently to any slight or lose social standing. A man who didn't fight when challenged couldn't get married, find work, or maintain friendships. Violence wasn't antisocial behaviour, it was pro-social, the glue that held communities together through mutual fear and respect. The church, supposedly preaching peace, blessed weapons and sanctified violence against outsiders. Knights existed specifically to channel violence productively. Even monks kept armed servants and weren't above crushing skulls when monastery property was threatened. In this world, pacifism wasn't virtuous. It was literally suicidal. The legal system didn't reduce violence, it institutionalized it. Trial by combat was considered the most reliable form of justice, because God would ensure the righteous won. Imagine being accused of theft, and your only defense is fighting your accuser with axes while judges place bets. These weren't rare events, but common occurrences in every town. Women could demand champions, creating a professional class of judicial killers who fought trials for pay. Children witnessed these legal murders regularly, learning that truth came from whoever survived longest. Even when formal combat wasn't required, violence permeated law. Punishments were explicitly physical. Hands cut off for theft, tongues removed for blasphemy, eyes gouged for looking lustfully. The logic was simple. Visible mutilation warned others and marked criminals permanently. A one-handed man was a thief. Everyone knew it and treated him accordingly. But legal violence was almost gentle compared to the mob justice that handled most disputes. When courts were distant and expensive, communities self-policed through brutality. Suspected witches were swum, thrown bound into water to see if they floated, guilty, or sank, innocent but drowned. Adulterers were stripped naked and whipped through town. Merchants who cheated were nailed by their ears to their own shop doors. These weren't vigilante actions, but community bonding experiences. Everyone participated, holding the victim, swinging the whip, jeering and throwing refuse. Children were brought specifically to learn how justice worked. Refusing to participate marked you as sympathising with criminals. The violence created social cohesion through shared complicity. After helping stone an adulteress, villagers were bound together by collective guilt and mutual assurance that they'd all acted righteously. The home was no refuge from violence. It was often the primary training ground. Beating wives and children wasn't just accepted, but expected. Proverbs advised husbands that women, like horses, needed regular beatings to stay obedient. Child-rearing manuals recommended daily floggings to drive out sin. This wasn't considered abuse, but love. Sparing the rod meant damning souls to hell. Children who weren't beaten were pitied as future criminals whose parents clearly didn't care. The violence was ritualised with specific implements for different offences and ages. Apprentices signed contracts acknowledging their master's right to reasonable chastisement, which could include broken bones if the lesson was important enough. Domestic violence was so normalised that women compared bruises like modern mothers compare children's achievements, and men who didn't beat their families were mocked as weak. Medieval entertainment centred on violence with an enthusiasm that would horrify modern audiences. Bear baiting, where dogs tore apart chained bears, was considered suitable for children's birthday parties. Cockfighting was a school sport, with boys raising and training birds specifically to kill each other. But the real crowd pleasers were human violence. Public executions drew thousands who paid for good positions and brought picnics. The violence was deliberately prolonged. Traitors hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while conscious, their organs burned before their eyes. The crowd didn't watch in horror, but cheered creative tortures and mocked victims who showed fear. Entrepreneurs sold food and souvenirs. Parents lifted children for better views. This wasn't hidden sadism, but open celebration of justice that reinforced community values through shared witnessing of extreme violence. Even religious practices involved violence that seems pathological today. Flagellant movements had thousands whipping themselves bloody in public processions. Stylites lived on pillars, mortifying their flesh until maggots dropped from their wounds onto horrified but admiring crowds below. Crusaders wore hair shirts that rubbed skin raw and practiced mortification, deliberately injuring themselves to share Christ's suffering. This wasn't fringe behaviour but mainstream spirituality. Children were taught that pain brought them closer to God, that suffering was holy, that inflicting violence on yourself or accepting it from others was the highest form of worship. Easter Passion plays involved real violence. Actors were actually whipped, actually crucified, carefully, usually surviving, actually wounded for verisimilitude. The audience didn't see this as excessive, but as properly honouring sacred events through authentic recreation. War transformed ordinary people into enthusiastic killers through social pressure and practical rewards. When lords called for levies, refusing meant losing your land and status. But participating meant potential wealth from looting, respect from neighbours, and stories to tell forever. Medieval warfare wasn't professional armies meeting in empty fields. It was total war targeting civilians. Chevauchés deliberately destroyed crops and villages to starve enemies. Soldiers were paid primarily in plunder, making rape and pillage not war crimes but salary. A successful campaign could transform a peasant into a landowner through stolen goods. Veterans returned home with wealth and respect, their violence validated and rewarded. Young men saw this and yearned for their own chance at glory and gold through killing. The aftermath of war spread violence like infection. Veterans brought home habits of casual murder, teaching communities that problems could be solved with swords. The psychology of medieval violence went deeper than just acceptance. It was a fundamentally different understanding of human worth and suffering. Medieval people didn't have our concept of universal human rights or inherent dignity. Your value was determined by birth, and violence against lower status people literally didn't count the same way. A knight killing a peasant paid a fine like damaging property. A peasant striking a knight faced mutilation or death. This wasn't hypocrisy but cosmology. They genuinely believed God created different grades of humans with different capacities for suffering. Peasants were thought to feel less pain, like animals. Nobles had refined sensibilities that made their suffering more significant. This hierarchical view of humanity made extreme violence against lessers not just acceptable, but often amusing. Knights would compete to see who could kill fleeing peasants most creatively. Lords would brand serfs like cattle for identification. The violence wasn't hidden or shameful. It was performed publicly to reinforce natural order. Medieval concepts of emotion and self-control were radically different from ours. They believed in humoral theory, that personality came from balancing bodily fluids. Too much blood made you violent. Too much yellow bile made you angry. These weren't metaphors, but medical facts that shape behaviour. If you were prone to rage, you weren't mentally ill, you just had unbalanced humours. The treatment? Bloodletting to remove excess blood, purging to eliminate bile, or contrary behaviours to restore balance. This meant violence was seen as medical condition, not moral failing. A man who flew into murderous rages needed bleeding, not punishment. This biological determinism removed moral agency from violence. You couldn't help having too much choler, any more than you could help having brown eyes. Society's job wasn't preventing violence, but channeling it appropriately, toward enemies, criminals, and social inferiors rather than equals or superiors. The medieval mind also lacked our understanding of psychological trauma. They had no concept of PTSD because constant violence was baseline normal. A soldier who became withdrawn after battle wasn't traumatised. He was melancholic and needed hot baths. A child who had nightmares after watching executions wasn't disturbed. They were weak and needed toughening. The symptoms we recognise as trauma responses were interpreted as character flaws or humoral imbalances. This meant no one received help processing violent experiences. Instead, they were told to pray harder, drink more, or simply accept that life was suffering. The accumulated trauma of generations created a society where emotional numbing was survival strategy. Feeling too much about violence made you unable to function, so they learned not to feel, passing this emotional armour to their children as essential life skill. Medieval time perception also enabled violence by making consequences feel abstract. Without clocks, precise scheduling, or linear life planning, they lived in an eternal present where future punishment seemed unreal. Combine this with belief in easy absolution, confess before death and all sins are forgiven, and violence carried little perceived spiritual risk. Kill someone in rage, confess next Sunday, rape during war, buy an indulgence, torture heretics. You're doing God's work. The afterlife was more real than tomorrow, and the afterlife could be negotiated through proper rituals. This temporal confusion made impulsive violence rational. Why restrain yourself when consequences were either immediate, unlikely given poor law enforcement, or eternal, manageable through confession? The future was uncertain, but the satisfaction of crushing your enemy's skull was immediate and tangible. Perhaps most importantly, medieval people experienced what psychologists now call moral disengagement on a societal scale. The constant presence of violence created psychological defense mechanisms that allowed normal people to commit atrocities without feeling like monsters. They used euphemisms, not murdering but giving justice, not raping but taking spoils, not torturing but questioning. They displaced responsibility onto authorities. The Lord ordered it, the church blessed it, everyone was doing it. They minimised harm through comparison. At least we didn't burn the whole village like the last army. They dehumanised victims as heretics, criminals, enemies of God. These weren't conscious strategies, but unconscious adaptations that let ordinary people participate in extraordinary violence while maintaining self-image as good Christians. The entire society collaborated in creating moral frameworks that made violence not just acceptable but righteous. The transformation of ordinary people into casual killers reached its peak during social upheavals. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 showed how quickly civilized behavior could collapse. Rebels who started demanding fair wages ended up parading nobles' heads on pikes, forcing captured enemies to kiss the severed heads of their friends before execution. But the truly revealing part was how naturally violence came to people with no military training. Blacksmiths became expert torturers. Brewers organised systematic executions. Children helped build gallows. The uprising wasn't chaos but organised violence by ordinary people who instinctively knew how to intimidate, mutilate and murder effectively. When the revolt was crushed, the reprisals were equally savage. Not from hardened soldiers, but from merchants and craftsmen deputised to restore order. Both sides showed that medieval people didn't need training to commit atrocities. Violence was so ingrained in their worldview that they could switch from peaceable citizen to efficient killer instantly. The Albigensian Crusade demonstrated how religious justification could transform entire populations into genocidaires. When Pope Innocent III declared heretics in southern France worse than Saracens, ordinary Catholics responded with enthusiasm that shocked even papal legates. Entire cities were depopulated not by professional soldiers, but by religiously motivated civilians who truly believed killing heretics guaranteed salvation. At Béziers, crusaders killed 20,000 people in a single day. Men, women, children, even Catholics who might have been sheltering heretics. "Kill them all, God will know his own," became the motto. But the killers weren't monsters. They were bakers, farmers, merchants who returned to normal lives afterward. They didn't suffer guilt or trauma because they'd done God's work. Their children grew up hearing how Daddy helped purify France, learning that extreme violence in service of proper ideology wasn't just acceptable but holy. The Black Death created conditions where survival required violence that would constitute war crimes today. As plague killed half of Europe, social order collapsed completely. The living abandoned the dying, but worse, they actively hunted suspected plague spreaders. Jews were burned alive in hundreds of communities by people convinced they'd poisoned wells. Flagellants whipped themselves bloody while murdering anyone who questioned their methods. Doctors were lynched for failing to cure patients. Priests were beaten to death for refusing last rites to plague victims. But the most disturbing violence came from ordinary families. Parents abandoned infected children to die alone. Children suffocated sick parents to claim inheritances before creditors arrived. Neighbours barricaded dying families inside houses and burned them alive to prevent contagion. This wasn't considered murder but community hygiene. Survival required becoming monstrous, and medieval people adapted with terrifying efficiency. What's most revealing about medieval violence is how quickly it could stop when conditions changed. The same people who tortured neighbours during witch trials became peaceful citizens when trials ended. Veterans who committed atrocities in war became gentle farmers in peace. This suggests medieval violence wasn't about inherent evil, but environmental programming. Remove the lead poisoning, eliminate the constant warfare, establish effective law enforcement, reduce childhood mortality, create economic stability, and the violence drops dramatically. We know this because it's exactly what happened. As these environmental factors improved in the early modern period, casual violence decreased proportionally. The same genetic stock that produced medieval killers produced Renaissance artists and Enlightenment philosophers. The only difference was environment. This has terrifying implications for modern society. We're not inherently less violent than medieval people. We've just removed most triggers for violence, but those triggers can return. Economic collapse, pandemic disease, environmental toxins, social breakdown, ideological extremism. Any combination could recreate medieval conditions. Modern Rwanda, Bosnia and Syria show how quickly civilized people can become genocidaires when environmental factors align. The medieval mind isn't extinct. It's dormant, waiting for the right conditions to re-emerge. Every human carries the capacity for medieval-level violence. The only thing preventing it is the thin veneer of civilization we've built. And that veneer is far more fragile than we'd like to believe. This isn't ancient history, so it's a warning. Every society is about 3 missed meals away from medieval violence. Every person carries the capacity to become a killer if the right environmental triggers activate. The difference between us and them isn't moral evolution. It's just better plumbing, rule of law, and lower lead levels. Understanding medieval violence matters because it shows how fragile peace really is, and how quickly humans can adapt to brutality when survival requires it. They weren't born to kill, they were made to kill, and given the right circumstances, so could we. Subscribe for more uncomfortable truths about human nature from history. Because pretending we're fundamentally different from our ancestors is the first step toward becoming just like them